It was late October 1942, and the Pacific War had reached a fever pitch. On Guadalcanal, the very future of the Allies in the South Pacific was being decided. The U.S. Marines on the island's northern tip held a single battered airstrip, Henderson Field, but enemy forces were launching crushing assaults to retake it. Supplies and reinforcements arrived from distant Japan every night, hidden under darkness. 3 PT boats, small, fast, wooden torpedo boats, patrolled the coastal waters. These were the waters of Iron Bottom Sound, named for the many ships sunk here. At 23:45 on October 19, 1942, Lieutenant Robert Bob Lynch crouched low in PT-48, 80 feet of mahogany fast patrol boat. His young face was set, eyes squinting through the night. 4 Mark 8 torpedoes sat primed in tubes aboard the craft, each with a 4.666-pound warhead. In theory, this boat was designed to cripple enemy warships. In practice, however, these torpedoes were useless against tonight's prey. Their minimum running depth was about 10 feet, while the barges drew only about 5 feet of water. The torpedoes would simply glide beneath them. All around him, the sea lay flat and silent under the tropical sky. A few hundred yards ahead, Lynch spotted the faint glow of running lights dancing on the black water. 3 Japanese Daihatsu barges were moving in formation along the coast of Guadalcanal. They were slow, lumbering vessels, about 50 feet long, used to move troops and ammunition down what Allied sailors grimly called the Tokyo Express runs. To the Marines on Guadalcanal, each successful run meant more guns and men arriving in the jungle. Every ton of ammunition and bundle of food on those barges was vital. Stop the barges, and you starve the enemy. Let them get through, and the Marines could be overwhelmed. Each barge bristled with a heavy Type 92 machine gun, and its hull was sheathed in steel plates about an inch thick, enough to deflect rifle bullets and .30 caliber rounds. Lynch's heart pounded. He was 26 years old and had made 14 night patrols with nothing to show but frustration. 6 PT boats in his squadron had already been lost in these waters this month. 17 of his fellow sailors were dead. The pattern was cruelly clear. PTs would rush in, fire torpedoes, and watch helplessly as those torpedoes ran harmlessly under the shallow barges. Then the barges' guns would open up. By morning, burning PT hulls would limp back to base, or worse. Tonight, it had to be different. It couldn't go on like this. "We need something bigger than torpedoes," Lynch thought. "Something that can punch through that armor." His Browning .50 caliber machine guns, which normally shredded enemy patrol boats, were firing blanks against the barge's steel plating. The flashes of tracer rounds only drew the enemy's attention. Lynch realized he needed an explosive weapon with far more punch. He remembered what he had seen that afternoon. At Henderson Field, under the dense jungle canopy, was a graveyard of wrecked planes. Japanese bombing raids had been relentless, but in the wreckage lay a secret. Along the runway sat dozens of P-39 Airacobra fighters, their twisted noses and broken wings silent. Unlike most fighters, the Airacobra had its engine behind the pilot, leaving room in the nose for a 37mm automatic cannon. In the living aircraft, that heavy gun could fire 150 explosive shells per minute at 2,000 feet per second, enough to rip through armor. Lynch could imagine one of those cannons on his boat, slinging shells into a barge's steel hull. A few hits would detonate fuel and ammo inside, and the target would burn from within. If the American forces on Guadalcanal ever needed such a weapon, it was now. He also remembered a fellow skipper's warning. A few months earlier, Lieutenant John F. Kennedy, before he was president, had tried a similar trick on his own PT-109. Kennedy had strapped a single-shot 37mm anti-tank gun to the bow with wooden beams. It fired one shell, then had to reload by hand, which took too long under enemy fire. It proved nearly useless. Better than nothing, someone had shrugged, but clearly not enough to win a battle. Tonight, though, Lynch needed more than better than nothing. He needed an automatic cannon with rapid fire. Could such a thing be gotten on a PT boat? He had an idea, but it was a gamble. Across Henderson Field that morning, Lynch had quietly floated his plan. Nobody in the Navy had official approval to do this. No kit existed to mount an aircraft cannon on a patrol boat. But desperation had loosened rules. Squadron Commander Alan Calvert simply nodded and said, "If you can make it happen, do it." By the next afternoon, Lynch assembled a makeshift salvage team. 4 sailors, plus Chief Machinist's mate Donald Fry from his crew, and Technical Sergeant James "Ducky" Coogan of the Air Corps. They gathered cutting torches, wrenches, rope, anything useful. As the tropical sun sank, Lynch's team worked among the broken planes on Henderson Field. Coogan, a veteran P-39 armorer, crawled beneath the nose of a smashed Airacobra. Every bolt and hose was familiar to him. Under the flickering light of lanterns, he removed the heavy bolts from the cannon mount. With a metallic groan, the massive 37mm cannon slid free onto the coral reef. Over the next few hours, crews stripped 2 more P-39s, pulling out 3 complete M4 cannons. One was damaged beyond use, the other 2 were intact. Each was a heavy beast, over 280 pounds, with its recoil mechanism and ammo feed attached. At one wreck, the bolts had rusted solid. Coogan poured aviation fuel on them and waited. After 20 minutes, he tried again, and the bolts finally gave way. By moonrise, the team had loaded 2 serviceable cannons onto trucks, and they began the ride back to Tulagi. Back at the PT boat base, the real engineering began. Placing an aircraft cannon on a small wooden boat was not in any manual. Lynch and Frey studied PT-48's bow. They decided on a plan. Weld a thick steel base plate to the deck, bolted into the oak frames below. From that plate, a short steel column would rise with a rotating collar on top. On that collar, a yoke would cradle the cannon and allow it to swivel. It was a crude design, something from a home workshop, but it would have to hold. The deck ahead of the wheelhouse was only 2 inches of plywood over oak. No one had calculated what would happen under a 37mm recoil, but they had no choice. They gathered scrap metal, landing gear struts from wrecked planes, old steel pipes, pieces of engine mounts. For 6 hours after sunset, Frey's welding torch blazed on PT-48's deck. Every few minutes the diesel generator sputtered out from low fuel, so they paused, weld 5 minutes, wait 5. Sparks flew and metal glowed hot under the full moon. By PT-100, the pedestal was complete. A thick, round base plate, a stout column, a turning collar, and a heavy cradle for the gun. It looked rough. Welds were thick and uneven, but it was sturdy. By 2200 hours, the makeshift mount was bolted down. Lynch and 2 sailors had hand-drilled each hole, taking 10 minutes of cranking per hole through plywood and oak. By midnight, the last nut was tightened. The hardest part came next, hoisting the cannon into place. With ropes and muscle, Lynch and his men wrestled the 280-pound gun into the yoke. They fed a loaded 30-round magazine into the breech. The cannon sat ready, pointing out at sea. On deck lay 5 more magazines, 150 shells, stacked in a tight pyramid. PT-48 was now armed with the first aircraft cannon ever mounted on a U.S. Navy patrol boat. The weapon had never been tested at sea, and the crew had never fired it in combat. But as Lynch patted the stock, he felt a quiet confidence. There was no turning back. That same night, under a sky blanketed with clouds and stars, PT-48 and her sister boats slipped out on patrol. 2 boats ran north of Savo Island, 2 prowled under Cape Esperance. Lynch chose to lead from the boat with the cannon. Each man on deck was tense. The ocean was eerily calm. Only distant flares and searchlights lit the sky. At 2,300 feet 5 hours, the radar crackled. 4 contacts, bearing 320, range 4,000 yards. Lynch's blood ran cold. 4 barges, almost directly ahead, coming fast under the cover of night. He swung PT-48 in silently to intercept. The barges moved like ghosts, their low diesel engines hardly more than a whisper. At 3,000 yards, Lynch made out the barges in silhouette. The first barge carried troops huddled behind its gun shield. Torpedoes were hopeless. This was the moment for the 37mm cannon. Lynch eased PT-48 closer. At 1,000 yards, he could see more details: crates on deck, a Japanese flag at the stern. He didn't hesitate. "Cannon ready," he said. Outside, a lookout shouted, "Machine gun fire!" The lead barge's Type 92 opened up. Tracer lines lanced toward PT-48. Bullets splashed the water a dozen yards short. The deck around Lynch rattled under impacts. He kept steering steady. "Fire!" Lynch yelled. In a thunderous roar, the 37mm cannon erupted. Its muzzle flash lit the bow like daylight. The wooden deck shuddered under the recoil. Gunners mate Harold "Hub" Mitchell held the trigger and leaned into the blast. Rat-tat-tat-tat-tat. 30 explosive shells thundered out in 12 seconds. They streaked across the water toward the lead barge. Crack, crack, crack. The first 3 rounds punched through the barge's armor belt above the waterline. Shards of steel flew into the night. Whoomp! The 4th shell found a fuel tank below decks and detonated it in a massive fireball. The barge's bow lifted as flames shot skyward. Crewmen and soldiers on deck screamed and dove into the sea. In seconds, the once menacing barge was a raging torch, bow up and sinking fast. Mitchell didn't stop to celebrate. He yanked out the empty magazine and slammed in the second one. Time stretched over those 8 seconds of reloading. The crew held their breath as the engine hummed and waves lapped against PT-48's sides. Then the cannon barked again. By now, PT-48 was only 600 yards away. Mitchell poured 30 more shells into the next barge. The second Japanese ship tried to turn, but it was too late. Black smoke billowed, and boom! It too exploded, bursting apart in flame. 2 barges were now burning. The remaining pair scattered in panic. Lynch swung PT-48 toward the southernmost target, torpedoes all trained forward as a precaution. Mitchell loaded his 3rd magazine. The heat was intense, the cannon barrel glowed red, and the crude mount's collar had begun to bind. Still, he tracked the fleeing barge. Rat-a-tat. The barge fired back. Tracer. Rounds punched through the night, one skipping across PT-48's deck behind Mitchell's position. Splinters flew. Mitchell held steady and fired 30 more rounds in half a dozen seconds. The enemy engine choked and died. The barge drifted, dead in the water. Survivors were abandoning ship. The vessel would never reach Guadalcanal, disabled by that final burst of fire. At 0020 hours, it was over. 90 37mm rounds had been fired. 2 Japanese barges were destroyed outright. A 3rd was crippled and burning. The 4th had escaped, smoking. PT-48 had taken no hits and lost no men. The improvised cannon had worked beyond all expectations. Lynch let out a slow breath and felt his hands tremble on the wheel. He tapped the radio. 2 barges sunk, 1 disabled. Cannon was effective. Then PT-48 turned back toward Tulagi. the fires behind them sinking below the horizon. The burning wrecks trailed smoke far behind, painting the clouds orange and black. For a moment silence fell over PT-48 as each man absorbed what had happened. After the fire by dawn, word of PT-48's triumph spread through the Solomons like wildfire. On Tulagi's docks, crews huddled around radios and exchanged astonished looks. "It works," Lynch's bare-bones report repeated. Within days, every PT commander in Squadron 3 wanted one of the flying cannons. Problem was, Henderson Field only had so many Airacobra wrecks. Salvage crews redoubled their efforts. By October 23rd, 2 more PT boats, PT-40 and PT-46, were fitted with M4 cannons, then PT-60 too. The teams at Henderson became surgical. They learned exactly which bolts to remove first. The second cannon was out in 90 minutes, the third in 70, the fourth in 55. On each mount, Chief Frey kept improving the design. After inspecting PT-48's mount, he machined bronze bearings into the turn collar so the gun swung smoothly. Within a week, the crude welds had become tough as armor plate. A new challenge emerged: ammunition. Each 30-round magazine weighed 40 pounds, and a PT could carry only about 6 of them on deck. But each barge battle could burn through 60-90 rounds. The airfield armory crews worked frantically, even through the dust and bomb blasts, hand-loading shells into magazines one by one. By winter, they averaged about 40 ready clips a day, barely enough to keep 4 boats in action for 2 patrols each night. It was a log jam, but the gunners found a rhythm. One sailor on each boat became the dedicated loader, hurling empty clips away and sliding new ones in as fast as they could. The tactical effect was immediate. PT crews started closing the enemy to about 400 yards, gunning forward with the 37mm, while a wingman laid down 50 caliber fire. Destroyer escorts tried to appear, but barges were so small a battleship's big guns overshot them at night. The Japanese barge crews felt the terror. Intercepted radio chatter spoke of devil boats with aircraft guns. Morale plummeted. Where barges once ran supplies almost unhindered, now the Tokyo Express turned into a nightmare. Squadron 3's after-action reports confirmed it. In 8 patrols after the cannons went in, they had attacked 23 barges, sinking 14 and damaging 6. Not one of their PTs was lost in those fights. In Washington, Navy staffers took notice. An official dispatch, sent November 1942, detailed the field modification and its results. The message was clear: PT crews had found a solution to a critical problem, and it worked. By December 7, 1942, the 1-year anniversary of Pearl Harbor, the Navy officially approved the innovation. Bureau of Ordnance ordered standardized 37mm pedestal mounts for PT boats and cut contracts for new guns. In record time, an official slot opened up for the weapon the crews had invented. For a touch of irony, the Japanese then began routing barges with cruiser escorts to try to avoid the PT's big guns, a response to the threat. But even as the bureaucracy scrambled to catch up, PT sailors on Guadalcanal were installing the real thing themselves. A fortunate supply drop helped. In mid-December, a ship delivered 12 brand-new M4 37mm cannons to the Solomons, originally meant for repairing Airacobras. Officially, they were earmarked for the Air Force. Unofficially, they went straight onto PT docks. By Christmas, every boat in the squadron had an aircraft cannon bolted to its bow. The difference was clear. These guns were factory fresh, and they pounded home every round. By January 1943, the PT squadrons in the Solomons, now nearly 24 boats strong, routinely carried 37mm cannons, and the results spoke loudly. In 37 patrols that month, PTs reported engaging 41 Japanese barges and destroying 41 of them. 19 more were damaged. Enemy losses were heavier and American losses far lighter. In fact, squadron records showed PT losses dropped by about 60% after the cannons arrived, where before PT, crews might lose a boat every few weeks to enemy fire during barge attacks. Now they returned nearly unscathed. With success, tactics evolved too. PTs began operating in coordinated pairs. One boat would engage the barges head-on with its 37 MIPIM, while the other provided covering 50 caliber fire and stood ready to launch torpedoes at any escort. Crews learned where to aim, fuel tanks, engine rooms, ammo stores, to achieve maximum effect. Ammunition supply lines were organized around this. An average barge engagement now required roughly 2 to 3 magazines, 60-90 rounds, to sink a target. Word of the PT cannon spread across the Pacific. In New Guinea, Squadron 8 arrived in March 1943, equipped with factory 37mm guns. In their first 3 months there, they accounted for over 60 Japanese supply barges in coastal waters, the same result as Guadalcanal. By June 1943, the Navy approved an even better cannon, the 37mm M9 with a longer barrel and higher velocity. The first M9s reached the South Pacific in late 1943, and new PT boats began rolling off production lines from Elko Higgins Electric Launch with M9s already mounted. The field improvisations had become standard armament. PT boats continued to gain firepower through 1944. In the Mediterranean, for example, PT squadrons off Italy took notice and mounted 37mm guns on their boats to fight shallow-draft enemy craft, with equal success. In October 1944, PT boats joined the Leyte landings in the Philippines. Japanese used every available small craft to reinforce their troops, and once again the PTs hunted them down. In one November sweep, 36 PTs engaged 87 enemy vessels off Leyte. 63 were destroyed and 19 damaged. Only 5 slipped away. Allied reports noted the carnage. Japanese barge traffic had all but stopped in that area, with PTs armed with 37s doing the killing. On August 15, 1945, Japan surrendered and World War II ended. Across the 4 years of war, 531 PT boats had served, 99 were lost to enemy action or accidents, and 432 survived. Almost all of those survivors bore their 37mm cannon mounts as badges of honor. Post-war Navy analyses were unequivocal. PT crews with 37mm cannons had been far more effective than those without, averaging roughly 6 times more enemy kills per patrol. Their casualties had plummeted. Quantitatively, PT boats with 37mm guns sank over 800 Japanese small ships and barges in the war. That meant on the order of 48,000 enemy troops, or 6,000 tons of supplies, never reached their targets. Japanese commanders later acknowledged the impact. One admiral noted that 3/4 of attempted supply barges to Leyte had been lost to PT attacks. The 37mm cannon's legacy spread beyond PT boats. Gunboats, landing craft, and auxiliary warships began mounting them as standard anti-surface and even anti-aircraft weapons. Today, 8 museum PT boats are preserved, many still displaying their 37mm bow guns. At Battleship Cove in Massachusetts, PT 6117 sits beneath a restored M9 cannon on its bow, a tangible link to that Guadalcanal night. The people behind the innovation faded into quiet lives. Lieutenant Lynch went on to earn a Navy Cross and commanded PT 48 through 47 patrols. He survived the war and later became an electrical engineer, never boasting about that first cannon shot. Technical Sergeant Ducky Coogan spent the rest of the war training PT crews to maintain the new guns. He retired from the Air Force in 1962, leaving behind detailed logs of those modifications. Chief Don Frey returned to shipyards in Tacoma, never knowing that his rough pedestal design became the basis for hundreds of standard mounts. Gunner's mate Harold Mitchell, who fired the first 30-centimeter shell from PT-48, later taught other crews, even on PT-109, how to use the cannons effectively. What began as a desperate field fix became one of the most powerful PT boat weapons of the war. It started on a cracked coral runway and a moonless Pacific night, with men who refused to accept defeat. In the end, those small wooden boats, once just torpedo carriers, prowled the darkness with the firepower of mini-destroyers. The roar of that 37mm cannon and the burning hulls of enemy barges changed the tactical balance in the Solomons. So remember that night. In the inky water off Guadalcanal, PT boats prowled with an airplane's gun on their bow. They proved that when the stakes are life and death, ingenuity can prevail. The barrels of that salvaged cannon threw lightning into the night, and barges burned at dawn. In that moment, sailors turned scrap metal into salvation and changed the course of the campaign with their tenacity and courage.